I normally get to immigration in South Africa, and the pronunciation of my name has a G, and they normally say Kiplagat. And I'm at pains to try and explain to them that our G is a little quieter. So it's Richard Kiplagat from Kenya, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share with you before your cocktails a little bit about how what you do is so important to the development of our countries and communities. And yet, you are faced across the board with challenges in the pace of execution. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what are the kind of elements that create obstacles to the pace of execution and project implementation risk. I come from an organization that is unique for this room, I think. We are external affairs consultants and advisors. We're strategic communications consultants. And we work across the continent in over 35 countries. And we've found that wherever we go, the pace of infrastructure investment is phenomenal on the continent. And I won't belabor the point, as I'm sure there has been many numbers that have been talked about. But this continent sorely needs additional infrastructure in energy, in roads, in ports, etc. And it is critical to social economic development that this infrastructure is put in place at pace. And one of the things that we have found when we looked at the studies is that over 80% of infrastructure projects on the continent, as per a study by PricewaterhouseCoopers, run over 6 months over time. We, in addition, found that over 50% inevitably had budget overruns, significant budget overruns, and in some cases to a point where projects became unviable. So we asked ourselves, what is the challenge here? And what we did as Africa Practice is we organized a round table, and we talked to government, and government said, you know, we have made commitments to the voters that we will deliver 10,000 kilometers of roads, and we are only at 5,000 kilometers of roads. And we talked to the project sponsors, and they said that, you know, our financial institutions and our shareholders are on our backs. And we talked to the banks, and the banks were terribly worried that some of these projects would not be able to pay for themselves if they continued to experience the kind of challenges and delays. We talked to development financial institutions who said we have resources allocated for infrastructure development, and yet we cannot disburse them. And therefore, social economic development in these countries is being held back significantly. And we realized that there is a unique situation, a situation where both private sector, development financial institutions, commercial banks, contractors, and government are all frustrated and aligned around this one single issue, which is the pace at which we're able to execute our infrastructure projects. And so we sat around a table. The Africa Development Bank was gracious enough to offer us their boardroom, and we discussed what are some of the things that come up. And none of them were engineering issues. And none of them were to do with you folks. Numbers add up. Thank you. The numbers add up. The calculations make sense. The formulas make sense. Very few of them were to do with the banks and the finances. So long as there were approvals, resources were available. We found that issues such as land access, the ambiguity around ownership, land disputes over land compensation, access, sensitivities with regards to cultural relevance of land, had been one of the primary causes of some of these delays. We found that local content, and I know conversations have been had here around local content, but these are not formal local content issues. These are perception issues where people perhaps, and I can give an example, and I know my friend and compatriot knows about the Turkana in northern Kenya, who heard that oil had been discovered in their province, in their county, and expected that regardless of the level of skill that they have, they would be employed en masse. And so how do you deal with that? And you know what they did is they put a few stones across the road and made sure that, you couldn't take your trucks and do exploration. We found that our institutions, such as the judiciary, whilst improving, being strengthened, are increasingly creating a litigious environment. And not only are tenders being disputed, but all manner of things are being taken to the courts and are creating delays. We also found that in many of our countries, regulation is not very clear, and some of it is evolving. And you find that the goalposts may change along the line between when you conceive your project and do all your feasibility studies and when you now hit the ground. We have an example, for example, in mining in our country, where there was new mining regulation that was put in place and significantly changed the numbers that made that project viable in the first place. We found that community relations, and I'm sure this is not new, and some of my panelists have talked about it, are absolutely critical for you to gain your social license to operate, not your legal license to operate. And then, let's be candid with each other. The reality is that transparency and integrity and rent-seeking is something that we find as a significant issue. And so there are delays that you cannot put into your project plan that emanate from somebody who wants to frustrate you so that you can come and talk to them and seek their assistance. So these are issues that are a reality, and we need to deal with them. So how the group sat around and they said, one of the things, and we haven't finished this work, but one of the things that is very clear is that the traditional approach to project risk management involves a lot of pre-study work. And it involves looking at the concept, the pre-feasibility, the banking feasibility, the fundraising. And once you do that, you have your financial close and you've checked, or you've done your ESIAs and your pricing and your due diligence. And yet that is what is called a snapshot. It is a photograph in a world that is a movie. It is dynamic. Things are not static. So you do your due diligence today around a certain set of stakeholders, and you find that things have changed. In Kenya, we're going to an election in August, and you may think that having a minister's brother as your shareholder will help you. But what if he loses? What happens next? We live in a dynamic environment. We do our risk mitigation and our studies in a static manner. That's something we need to think about. So we came up with a set of recommendations. And again, as I say, these are things that are work in progress and will need to be tailored to every different situation, scenario, and geography. But the first one is quite clear. There is clear need to have a comprehensive and continuous risk management as an integral part of your project design and structure. Not as a snapshot, but as a continuing stakeholder engagement structure and investment in your project. The second thing that we heard is that there is often a lack of clarity around understanding who owns this stakeholder risk between the funding, between the sponsor, between the contractor, and often things fall in between the cracks. I can see that I've been given a warning here. So let me move a little faster. So a couple of things here. A community engagement mechanism. For me, if you have a physical footprint, and all infrastructure projects do, you must have a well thought through community engagement management mechanism. The second thing, which is often forgotten, is that it's important to think about the perception of your project, both in terms of local and national perception of your project. The example of Talo was around a perception that oil revenues would accrue immediately, despite the reality that the life cycle of oil exploration and production is multiple years, maybe even sometimes decades. So management of your perception needs to be an integral part of what you're putting into your plans. Continuous due diligence as opposed to a one-off. Public affairs and government engagement. Always monitoring relationships with your regulator, with your government, with local government, as well as national government, and as well as line ministries, as well as the legislature as a whole. Risk responsibility assignment upfront, and it's actually not a very complicated thing. Work through at the beginning of your project with all your internal stakeholders, your project sponsors, your financiers, your bankers, etc., and agree on whose responsibility is for what. Ultimately, what my ask for you is not to underinvest in the non-engineering elements of project success. It is difficult to quantify the benefit. It's almost a little bit like insurance. You will feel the dollar and cents and rands pain after the fact. But since this is a progressive gathering of the best minds in engineering, I ask you to think about making sure that up front you spend the requisite amount of time, resources, and thought to this slightly intangible but clearly vital element of accelerating project implementation and impacting positively the social economic development of Africa. Thank you.